Welcome back. Rob Port in for Jay Thomas, 701-293-9000, 888-970-9329. Big news this week. A lawsuit coming for North Dakota's voter ID laws being brought by the Native American Rights Fund, which is representing a group of Native American voters here in the state of North Dakota who said that they were disenfranchised by the state voter ID law. Matthew Campbell, who is a lawyer for that group, on with me now. Matthew's based out of Colorado. Matthew, thanks for your time.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it.
Yeah, certainly. Thanks for being on. Explain your case for us. What's the problem here?
Well, Rob, I thank you for having me. I just think that in our position is that everyone who's qualified to vote should have the right to vote, and including Native Americans. I think the law has an impact on people all across North Dakota. I think we've seen stories of people that have been impacted by the law. When we looked at it, it looks to have a disproportionate impact on Native Americans in North Dakota. And under the Voting Rights Act, if there's a disproportionate burden on groups like that, it's unacceptable. So that's, again, the main thing is that we want to ensure that everyone has the right to vote.
Sure.
We don't want our veterans and our elders being turned away when they've served this country or voted for 40 or 50 years. So
I don't want anybody who's eligible to vote and wants to vote to be denied the ability to vote. That said, I think a lot of people look at the voting process in North Dakota compared to other states where we don't have voter registration, and the process is, I think, pretty streamlined. Most people that I talk to about this say, wow, it's easier to vote in North Dakota than it is, say, Minnesota. Just generally speaking, in terms of the process you got to go through so that you can cast that ballot on Election Day. They say North Dakota is one of the easiest states in the nation. So
right,
I guess, okay, go ahead.
Right. Well, I think, back in the 1950s when North Dakota did away with registration, they set up the small precincts so that the election board would know who the voters are that come to the polls. And that's kind of how North Dakota had the voucher fail-safe system that was in place until 2013, that, if someone from the election board or the poll workers knew who you were because you've voted there for 50 years in a row, they would allow you to vote because they know you're a community member, they know you live here, they know you're a veteran or an elder that's from here, and so they'll let you vote. And that's what was done away with in 2013, I think. And, North Dakota was one of the top-ranked election administration states for the last 3 running years before the voter ID law was passed. So I think looking at that, it looked like you had a very good system and a system that worked very well. And I think that's kind of what we want to go back to, is just something that has that fail-safe provision for people that, have trouble getting an ID or may forget their ID or have it lost. Or even for someone who goes through all the steps and does everything correctly, it still has a problem voting.
Well, there's some practical realities to that, though. 701-293-9000 if you want to join the program, 888-970-9329. What you're talking about is previously when voters came to the polls, if they didn't have their ID, they could essentially fill out an affidavit and then vote anyway, and basically they're just attesting to the fact I am a qualified voter in this district and I can cast this ballot, and then they were allowed to vote. The problem is that nobody was going back and double checking on those things. And even if they were going back and double checking on it, the election's held in November. Immediately following the holidays in January, the people that we just voted into office take office, including the legislature, which begins their legislative session, and we have a governor in office who is involved in the whole process as well, and budgeting and everything else, immediately start doing their jobs. So I think a lot of people, when the legislature did away with that, what they were looking at is we don't really have any way to verify if you show up at the polls and you just sign a form. Nobody's going back and double checking on these things. And if we did go back and double check and found that fraud for some reason impacted the outcome of an election, we'd be in we'd have a big problem because we'd have legislators seated and voting on laws by the time we detected it. Is that not a concern?
Well, I think first, there was the affidavit provision that you're mentioning, but there were 2 fail-safes prior to 2013. There was the first one I was talking about where a poll worker or an election board member that knew you and knew you lived in the community could vouch for you.
Yeah.
And provide you the ballot. If they knew you've lived here for 40 or 50 years and voted all that time, they could vouch for you. Now, if they didn't know you, that's where you're right. They had the affidavit system where you could sign an affidavit and swear under penalty of perjury or, fraud or whatever that you live in this county, that you live in this precinct, and that you're qualified to vote. So there were two fail-safe provisions, I think, that we're talking about here.
Yeah.
And in terms of the affidavit provision, I'm not sure. I'm not as familiar how it worked. I don't know why, it takes so long to look at the affidavits. I mean, if it was a matter of timing, perhaps there maybe should have been an investigation into how the affidavit system worked and what were the different various methods that could be provided to make that a more streamlined process. I just don't know, exactly enough about how it worked, how it was investigated, why they weren't looking at the affidavits in a timely manner to be able to say this person is who they are. There's other states that have an affidavit fail-safe mechanism, and it seems that in those states it seems to be working pretty well. So,
their timing on the legislative session, and that may not be the same as ours. I mean, our Constitution requires that the legislative session start in January. That doesn't give a lot of time to go back and check. I think in one election cycle there were something like 10,000 of those affidavits, filed. That's a lot to go back and check. And let's, setting that aside, if your lawsuit goes forward, are you satisfied with any voter ID requirements in the state? Or, if your lawsuit succeeds, what's it going to mean for voters in North Dakota?
Well, if it succeeds, I think we would like to see it go back to the way it was before 2013, where you had those two fail-safe mechanisms. Of course, there was a voter ID law in place before 2013, but you had those fail-safe mechanisms that were similar to all the other states that have voter ID laws, have similar or different fail-safe mechanisms for people that jump through the hoops yet still can't vote.
As far as poll workers attesting for people, North Dakota was one of the states with the fastest growing population over the last several years. I think there was a lot of concern that sort of that old way of doing things worked back when North Dakota was a much smaller state, and I guess we're still a pretty small state, but we've got a lot of new faces in our state this year. I think a lot of people sort of looking at that and saying, that's sort of an informal system where you have a poll worker vouching for people or what have you. Is it practical in a state that's been changing as fast as North Dakota has been?
Well, I can't answer that question. I think that's a question for maybe the North Dakota legislature to look at. And
well, they did look at it, though, and that's how we got to where we are.
Well, and then, like I said, I think the other states that have these strict voter ID laws still have these fail-safe mechanisms that ensure that everyone is entitled to vote, when they prove that they're qualified and be entitled to vote so that, no one's turned away.
How many people, when I was looking through your lawsuit and I saw that you had accumulated a lot of research in your filing that our Secretary of State was served with, how many people would you say, fall into that category where they don't have a driver's license and they don't really have, I guess, the ability to get to a DMV and get a non-driving ID, which costs $8, or I think there's even a mechanism where you could get it for free. In your estimate, how many people fall into that category in the state?
I don't have any numbers off the top of my head or anything like that. One thing I've seen is a survey, I think, that the County Auditors Association did after the last general election, and of the 25 county auditors that responded, I want to say they reported that 1,200 people were turned away because of voter ID issues. And so, just looking at that, that's kind of one of the numbers I have off the top of my head. But other than that, I don't have any numbers, estimates, on me to provide you right now.
We have a caller on the line, Ron from Moorhead. Ron, what's up?
Yeah, that old system wasn't a fail-safe system either. If you think about what your current caller is talking about, or your current person you're talking to, if you really think about the fail-safe that he's talking about, it's not a fail-safe. It doesn't work. It's after the fact. You don't want ambiguity, and you don't want subjectiveness in somebody who's, oh yeah, I know him. Whatever.
Yeah,
Get an
I
ID.
mean, thanks for the call, Ron. I mean, how is it if we have a situation where, a poll worker may know me as Rob Port lives in Minot. Sure, I know Rob. How do they know I live in that district? I mean, how do they know that I haven't moved? I mean, do the poll workers keep track of? They may not know what my address is. They may not know where I'm living right now. I mean, how do we know? How are these poll workers really expected to know for any significant portion of the electorate where they're living and if they're qualified to vote in that particular district?
Well, I can't speak on behalf of the poll workers, Ron, but I know that they did have extensive training on what the laws were, what the requirements were before the elections, and I think if anyone was found to be violating that, they would probably be in some serious trouble. But again, I can't speak on behalf of the poll workers.
Yeah, it just seems unreasonable to expect them to know. They may know me, but how do they know where I live? I guess. You served as the Secretary of State. I mean, what's the timeline here? I mean, can you give us sort of a heads up of what's the next steps? What can we expect next out of this case?
Well, I think we've served the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of State will get some time, and the State AG, we provided a courtesy copy, will get some time to look at this and provide an answer, and roughly 30 days or so, and then we'll go from there.
Matthew, thanks for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.